Alright guys, in this video we're going to attempt to do the second one under the beginner patterns. It's pattern 2. This one's kind of interesting because it's not really, it may not look like a repeating pattern at first glance, but it does tile. This one's kind of has a more organic look. It's a little more chaotic than that previous one we did. This one's kind of cool though because it's going to show you a really powerful node in here called the slope blur grayscale. These are amazing nodes that you can use if you ever want to do edge damage on something. So I'm kind of excited to show you guys this one right here. All right, we're going to do a new graph. Let's do Command N. We're going to call this pattern 2 2040 by 2048 empty template. Let's hit OK. Now the first thing we want to do is figure out how do I get just the general shapes of this thing. I'm going to start off with typing in. We're going to do space, type in cell. Now it's a little hard to see these, but we have a couple different types of cells. We have cell 1, 2, 3, 4. Let's see what we got here. Here's cell 1, kind of a blurry cell. Okay, let's do cell 2. This one's interesting. That actually feels a lot closer. Cell 3. Okay, this one is much thinner. These are almost kind of, they'd be pretty good for cracks, I think. And let's check out cell 4. So I'm just exploring all my different options with cell patterns. I think really any of these would potentially work. Let's get rid of this one. I don't like the blurred effect. These are probably too thin. Now what I'm kind of looking at is this guy, which gives us the thick lines right from the beginning. And then we have this one, which you'll notice if I zoom in really close. Let me click back here. See how they actually are the same shapes? So this is an edge detect version of that guy right there. So really we could start with any of these and probably get the exact same result. Let's do this one just so you guys can kind of see the edge detect again. We're going to get rid of that. All right. So I'm kind of starting with this, sort of almost a fractal kind of mosaic looking effect. What I'm going to do is create an edge detect, and if you guys have watched the first pattern video, the one before this, you've probably already seen me use edge detect, but the edge detect currently on those shapes is doing a really terrible job. We're going to pull down the roundness. Okay, if I kind of ease that back, you'll notice, all right, if I feather it enough, like it kind of looks like the other pattern. Now the cool thing about this is because we're doing the edge detect, we're not just starting with that other cell pattern. This means we get to pick and kind of choose how thick we want those lines to be. Now I am going to leave it at 2 for now. We'll kind of see what this looks like later. But let me go back to the reference. My big thing is they just need to be larger in general. They're much bigger here. These are very tiny. So on the cell, we're going to click. We have a scale. Let's just bring that down a little bit. I don't necessarily know what the magic number is going to be for this. I'm just kind of eyeballing it at the moment. That feels closer. I think this would probably be about right. We're going to go with this. So I'm just kind of around a scale of 9, somewhere in that ballpark, 9 or 10. They're all probably going to work out pretty well. We'll maybe do 8. All right. Kind of digging that. Now, if I did want to get different versions of this, I'll show you kind of a cool trick. Back on the cell, there's a random seed. Watch what happens if I go through this. See how it's like just giving you different variations of the same effect? So it's kind of a cool way where if you build something and you just want to get a couple variations of the same type of texture, you can just save out different random seeds to kind of and use those across different surfaces. Pretty cool stuff. So you don't have to rebuild the whole thing from scratch. Now let's jump into the slope blur grayscale. So I'm going to have this guy selected. We're going to do space, slope, blur, grayscale. Now this is going into the input, but you'll notice nothing's happening. I'll just double click on that node to make sure we are looking at it. Okay, I don't see anything. There's some sliders. Nothing's really happening. Now the reason this isn't doing anything is because this guy needs a second input. The slope blur grayscale is going to blur the edges of the shapes based on a secondary pattern. We're going to try using the Perlin noise. And Perlin noise is in Painter. And so you probably have seen this guy before if you've been digging around in their procedurals. Gaussian noise is another pretty popular one that's very, very similar to this. Now watch what happens if I put the Perlin noise on the input of slope blur grayscale. Okay, this looks much different. Now it doesn't look good. It's kind of an interesting effect, but that's not really what we're going for. So what happened? Well, what we want to do is go back to the slope blur grayscale. We're going to bump up the samples. I usually like to go fairly high, around like 20. You could go higher than that if you want, but our bigger issue is just sort of reducing the amount of intensity from this pattern. So let's bring this guy back. And as I start fading back the intensity, you can almost see, if I go low enough here, eventually we're going to get back the original shape. Yeah, see what it's doing? If I go all the way to 0, it's really touchy. But if you just move it a little bit, it starts to warp and distort those textures. Let's go look at the reference again. I'm seeing the waves as being a little more broad and large. These are kind of, there's a lot of small pockets. Now the nice thing here is because it's all coming from the Perlin noise, the scale of the Perlin is going to affect how big those waves are. Because again, that's what's distorting the texture. So let's bring down the Perlin scale. So notice as I reduce that, they're a little bit more broad and swooping and not as like intense and small scale. So we're going to go to maybe, let's do something around 20 maybe, and then on back here, I'm just going to bump up that intensity just a little more. We'll maybe do something like that, right around there. Let me go back here, let's check the thickness. Okay, I think we're in a pretty good spot. My next thing is we need to make this more black and white. Now, once I've blurred it, after this, we're going to drop in a levels. And let's kind of just back up just a little bit. And we're going to move this up. This is black point. See, I'm kind of getting rid of those blurred sections, and I'm eating into the shape. Let's move that up. And then I could go all the way over if I wanted to. If I felt like I didn't want to erode too much, I could maybe stop here and then push the white over. Let's see how close we got. I think it's looking pretty good. I think what I may do is overall the cracks seem a little thin. So maybe back on the edge detect, we decide, well, what if it should have been a 3 on the width? See how that's kind of thickened everything up? Let's check that out. That feels a little closer to me. I don't know what you guys think. I kind of like that. We're probably pretty close. Again, this is not going to be an exact one-to-one match. There's no way we're going to get every single piece to be the same. We're just trying to get something that feels relatively close. And if I hit space to tile it, you can see this does repeat. Really, even at this point right now, you can tell this would be kind of cool for like a nice little cobblestone walkway. All right, so what else are we missing here? I've got the shape. We need to get these little tiny dots in here. Okay, that should be pretty easy. Let's hit space. We're going to do Gaussian. Let's do probably one of the Gaussian spots. Let's see. Well, let me check Gaussian spots 2. What's that guy doing? Yeah, we're going to stick with Gaussian spots 1. And I'm going to kind of leave this kind of the way it is. Let me put it underneath this guy. We're going to do a levels, because you'll notice that in the reference here, these are much more defined kind of little dots. It's not these kind of blurry, puffy shapes. So we're going to do a levels, and I'm just going to like move this over to clip out a bunch of them. Try to get some thicker sections, and I'm bringing the contrast up just to create these kind of harsher little shapes. So something kind of like this. That's closer, but if I go back here, I think I have like the general idea, but there's way more of them and they're a lot smaller. Let's go to the Gaussian, take the scale, let's bump it up. So I'm at a scale of 3. Maybe that feels pretty close. Let's try that out. All right, now I have this. How do I blend this into this guy? We're going to make a blend node, and this just comes down to kind of playing around with the different settings until we end up with the right one. So I'm going to take this in the background, and I'm going to put this in the foreground. So usually the way I kind of think about this is the background I think of is what is your base layer, and A input, the foreground, that is what are you introducing. So this is where I'm starting. This is what I'm introducing into this one. So this is probably what I'm going to put on the A input. But either one would work. Let's double click. Okay, it's overlapping. We're going to go over here, change the blend to subtract. And subtract is going to subtract the white color from this white, which is basically making these little black pockets. Let's check it out. I feel pretty good about that. Possibly my dots are maybe a little sparse. I could maybe play around with like the amount of Gaussian spots, scale it a little bit, play around with the levels to like shrink or scale up the amount of them. But I think overall this does feel pretty good. And maybe one final touch here is if I kind of zoom in, you'll notice that the sharpness of the edge does kind of vary a little bit. Sharp, blurry, kind of aliased. One final touch I could do, if I want to get rid of the aliasing, is I'm going to do a blur HQ grayscale. Let's back up. This is blurring everything. We're going to ease the intensity back a lot. I don't want to go too far. I'm just doing this to kind of like clean up these small, that stepped aliasing. I'm just trying to feather that out a little bit. Let's do like 0.5. And then I'm going to do a levels after that to re-tighten up the edge. Something like this. There we go. So see how that looks better than this? It's a little trick I do quite a bit. Anytime I have some aliasing issues, I'll just do a blur to soften the edge and then blur it to kind of tighten that shape back up. This is also the same trick we might do to bevel edges to like round corners in some of the other videos. But there we go. I'm feeling pretty good about that. Again, not an exact one-to-one, but you can tell we are pretty close to getting this one where it needs to be. And that does tile.